It's a funny place to be, stuck in a seemingly mundane world with an inner knowing that the universe is so much more than our mortal minds can comprehend. Yet we all have the capacity to know peace and our oneness with the wholeness of life. And through these interviews, discussions, and reflections, it is my intention to share this possibility. I'm Ryan Kurzak, and this is the Kriya Yoga Podcast. Welcome back, everyone, to the Kriya Yoga Podcast. We've got a wonderful guest today. We're going to be looking at the Yoga Sutras. We have Zoe Mai with us, who is the director of the American Sanskrit Institute. And it was through the American Sanskrit Institute that I first began a more in-depth, I think, serious study of the Yoga Sutras, because once you start to see how the language works, you understand things a little bit differently. But anyway, welcome, Zoe. It's wonderful to have you today.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm so glad to have you here because while I have chatted with Vyaas Houston once or twice, he was the director before you, correct?
Yes, he's the founder.
Yes. The founder. I never really got a chance to pick his brain. And the thing that always fascinated me about the Yoga Sutras, aside from the interesting information in there, was how people got what they got from the sutras. Meaning I would have texts in front of me about this translation, that translation, this translation. And then I got the Yoga Sutras workbook from the American Sanskrit Institute. And I would be reading through it, and I would read these direct translations of the sutras. And I wondered to myself, how on earth did these translators get what they wrote from what's in this book?
That's such a great thought.
Well, so let's start with that. I mean, I know we have some interesting themes that we want to cover today, but do you have any insights into that? When you see someone writing translations or commentaries, do you ever do the same thing and think to yourself, where did that come from?
Yeah, in fact, my initial experience with the Yoga Sutras was that the commentaries were so varied and so confusing that I became very discouraged until I met Vyaas and started studying with him. What I think, I've given this a lot of thought. And what I think is that you're familiar with the term vrittis, So the Yoga Sutras speak to the individual at where they are, at the level that they are. So there are many layers of understanding that are within the sutras or offered through the sutras. And so wherever somebody is, what they're experiencing, they're having an experience, and then their commentary derives from that experience. And so it's not that it's wrong or that these varied, one is right and one is wrong. It's that it's really rooted in that author's experience. And so that translator may speak to you, and then you would stick with that person or that book. So, but what I've found is, for me personally, that there's a depth that occurs. So there's a deepening of understanding that occurs. So you go through these layers as you experience them, these layers of understanding. And it's really more about direct experience than intellectual study. That's what I've learned from Vyaas. And so so the commentaries are really the vritti of the translator.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because I can remember even reading a passage from the sutras or studying the sutras, and then, say, a few years later, going back and reading it again and contemplating it again, and having a whole other idea about what it was indicating, what it meant. And even recently, I've had this book, this workbook, for at least 20 years now, I think. And
wow. Okay.
Yeah, I've had it for a while. That's why it's fallen apart, and and a few other commentaries. And as I was going through and doing a discussion on the yamas and niyamas, I saw something in the book which somehow every time I read it, I missed. And that was when it was discussing the yamas and niyamas, it was talking about how this is the great vow, or Mahavatra. Is that
Mahavratam? Yeah.
Yes. And that was, I've been looking at this for decades, and I saw it and I thought, oh my goodness, how on earth have I missed that every single time?
Isn't that amazing? It's amazing. It happens all the time. Yep.
Yeah. And my other thought was, when it comes to the translations, one of the things I kept noticing was when I would look at like the direct, as Vyaas would write out here, I would read something like Abhyasa practices vigilance in remaining there. That would be the phrase. And then I'd go read someone else's commentary, and like that one sentence somehow turned into a whole paragraph of translation. Right. So is that just from maybe understanding different nuances of the Sanskrit words or terminology, or is it just more of what you were talking about previously?
I think it is more of what I was talking about previously. One of the things about Vyaas is that he is an amazing translator. He's a perfectionist in him. He has this deep understanding of the grammar. He's intellectually just so incredibly sharp. And so, plus he has this connection to the sutras through his own meditation practice. So when he writes them like this, what it does is it gives the student or the person that's studying his text the opportunity to have their own experience with it, with the actual literal translation. Right. And so that's why, he just translates it that way. And he's the same with the Bhagavad Gita as well. Like the translations are just so pristine, and to watch him translate is just, it's insane. But yeah, so he doesn't do any flourishes. I had a teacher, meditation teacher, who's a great Sanskrit scholar, who would have so many, he would turn it into a poem, one line, he would turn into a whole poem, which was beautiful, but it was really all his vritti, his experience of it. So we were getting to experience his experience. Right. But not our own experience. Mm-hmm. So,
yeah. And I do think that is why I, of all of my translations and commentaries, I always go back to this American Sanskrit Yoga Sutra workbook.
Isn't that amazing? That's wonderful to hear, actually.
Yeah, because it just goes straight to it. And I remember getting the on cassette tape, he would recite the Yoga Sutras. So I had it on cassette. I would stick it in the car. And recently I got the MP3 files for it, because I also think it's useful to hear how it's supposed to be pronounced and to chant along with it. Which leads me to another question. You mentioned how Vyaas meditated on the sutras and studied them. So from your perspective, how do you recommend or inspire individuals to learn this, to contemplate the sutras, to meditate on the sutras? Is there any particular way that you find helps them have their own direct experience of it?
This is the $1 million question. So this is basically Vyaas. He had memorized all of the sutras, and through that experience, a mandala actually came to him. So he began to experience them in this 4 or 5 dimensional framework, where he was experiencing the subtle quality of them. Mm-hmm. And the reality is the Yoga Sutras are not a linear text. It is it's not linear, but it does have little segments of linearity. Right. And so what seemed to happen for him was that in his meditation, they began to assemble themselves within his consciousness. But the reason he started doing the Sanyama meditation, which is the meditation described in the 3rd chapter, Dharana, Dhyana, and Samadhi, the 3 together is one. And he'd been very ill. And one of the later sanyamas, which is, I think it's 344, the Bhuta Jaya is the one that he did. And it's for health.
Is that the one where you focus on the navel?
No, but that's a good one.
Okay.
I haven't actually done that one. I've only really done the ones that Vyaas taught me. So it's the mastery of the elements as they exist in the body. Mm. And then the promise, he gives us the Sanyama, Patanjali, and then he gives us the result, which, sometimes they're considered the siddhis. The result would be from emergence of such powers as becoming minute, the perfection of the body, non-injury through heat, cold, sickness by its constituents. Mm. So that's the first one. And, I have a lot written here for this one. It's like, wow, because there's so much room to write in this workbook. Yeah. Form, beauty, strength, and diamond compactness is the perfection of the body. So he started doing the Bhutajaya Sanyama for his own health, and it did heal him. Mm. And he did it for he's been doing it for over 50 years now, I think. But he, what seemed to happen is that the sutras began to assemble themselves, and he began to understand them in a different way and how they work together. And he moved on from this Sanyama, the 344, to the Sanyama 47, which is mastery of the senses. These are the two main sanyamas that aren't really concerned with powers as much as they're concerned about self-knowledge. Right. And dismantling ego. Indriya Jaya dismantles the ego. Bhuta Jaya brings your chitta into the body, into all the elements of the body. So, and then moving from there into the Indriya Jaya, where you begin to dismantle the ego in a movement towards Ishvara Pranidhana. Right. So this I believe was revealed to him by the sutras themselves. He started with the Bhuta Jaya for a very simple reason, and it became so. And it's been an amazing experience for me. I've been practicing the Sanyama practice for years now, and this is how the sutras reveal themselves to you, through experience. Now, there's the other way is also through translation. You can, if you engage the Sanskrit, it's just as powerful. It's kind of powerful.
You've touched upon so much there. First, when you were talking about the nonlinearness of the sutras, I had attempted writing a commentary on the sutras, and what I found useful about that was, number one, contemplating the information, but then what I appreciated was once I got to the end, at the end of chapter 4, it was like it looped back on itself. It was almost like now we're back at the beginning, where it's now talking about abiding as the self again. It was I remember that moment when I completed those first final sutras and commentary and thinking, wow, this is just one big loop that just keeps spiraling in on itself. So I appreciate the nonlinearness about it. And you talking about chapter 3, and as I mentioned in an email, when I would refer to the sutras, because I'm a teacher in the Kriya Yoga tradition, and Yogananda was told by Sri Yukteswar to teach Kriya Yoga from the sutras. So, of course, we focus on that. And Vyaas, from what I recall, he also had taught quite a few times at Center for Spiritual Awareness with Mr. Davis, or for the retreats there. But I would always veer away from chapter 3 when it came to talking about the sutras, because in my mind, people got caught up in, as you described, the powers of what's there. And what you're telling me, I've never really, it's never been shared the way you're sharing it, that what's coming to me is that these are tools that can be used to assist us on our awakening path. And you mentioned that these particular sutras, that they focus on that. And the one I always told people to focus on, if they wanted to focus on any of them, was contemplating friendship to develop moral and spiritual strength. I said, if you're going to do any of them, just focus on that one.
No, that's really good. That's beautiful.
Yeah. But what I'd like to ask you, could you describe for those of listeners who are really new to a lot of this, what is this practice that you're talking about? When we get into chapter 3, what exactly is being described there as a practice?
Okay, so chapter 3, basically what's being described, I can really, so the first sutra is Desha Bhandas Chittasya Dharana. So dharana is the focusing of chitta within a specific location. So you could almost say like dharana is just choosing a point of where you're going to send your chitta. In the case of the sanyama that we do, the Bhutajaya, the location is going to be one of the great elements in the body. So we would start with the element water or earth, something like that, as it exists in the body. So you're just choosing that point. Then the second sutra, the single directionality, which is Tatra Pratyayika Tanata Dhyanam. So dhyanam, meditation, is really the movement of consciousness to that point. So there's consciousness is actually moving, pratyaya. That word implies movement or states that there's a movement. So you're moving your chitta or your consciousness into the water element of the body. Well, let's say that.
Okay.
And then once we have samadhi, tad e bharata matra nirbhasam, svarupa shunyam iva samadhihi, that chitta specifically appearing as the object alone, as without a form. So chitta almost being like your consciousness, but a mirror, that it comes in and it fully reflects the element as it exists in your body to the exclusion of everything else.
Right.
So the 3 of these things, dharana, choosing the point, dhyana, sending chitta there, and samadhi, absorbing chitta fully, the 3 of these together as one is sanyama.
Okay.
So that's what we're doing. And
go ahead.
No, and so with the elements, you would do it through the elements, with the elements through the body. There are other sutras that Vyaas uses, or that we use now, all of us that are doing the meditation, to aid that process. So there are sutras that aid that process.
Okay. And with this idea here, you're directing your awareness or your attention. And I'm kind of focused on this word pratyaya, where it says the arising thought which directs chitta to an object. Could we kind of consider that as though, all right, now you need to use your mental capacity to, as an entry point, begin thinking about what you know this to be?
Yes. So that would be the other sutras come in from chapter 1, Savitarka, using language to move chitta. And then nirvitarka, once chitta is fully absorbed, nirvitarka, letting go of language.
Right.
And then the same thing with savichara, into the subtle space, and then nirvichara, letting go of language in the subtle space.
Right. Okay. Interesting. And, as I listen to you talk, and I hear more of this as well, in order to experience that cognitive absorption or that samadhi and holding that alone, for example, if you're talking about contemplating the water element, or that's just the word I'm using, but contemplating the water element, you have to have a sense of being able to practice in the yamas and niyamas, non-attachment, because otherwise you're going to be attached to all these other things and you can't sink your awareness into the thing you want to sink it into.
What seems to happen for people initially, yeah, absolutely. What seems to happen for people when they first start doing the meditation, it was for me as well, that when you engage the water element, first it's like all outside your body, like you're imagining waterfalls and rivers and oceans or the rain, whatever, like all of these external things. But eventually, the more you bring chitta in, it becomes still gross, because you're doing it, the gross first, the blood and the wetness of the eye, but it really does. So there is a non-attachment that has to occur with what your understanding is of water and your experience of water. It
Right.
happens kind of naturally though, but I have learned from teaching this meditation that it wasn't just me that had that experience. A lot of people have that experience. It's really wise of you to recognize that non-attachment is necessary right from the get-go.
Right. Well, the thing that I've been trying to share with people when it comes to the sutras, when we look at the 8 limbs, that they're all required. For example, let's take the idea of contentment. As you can tell, I've been focused on yamas and niyamas a lot. But if you take the idea of contentment, or santosha, is that correct?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, santosha. If you take that idea, well, when you sit to meditate, of course you're going to meditate or be able to focus your awareness much better if you are already able to access a state of contentment, because you're not troubled by all the other things. So what I've been trying to do is instill that when it comes to the 8 limbs of yoga, you can't just say, I'm going to meditate every day for 3 hours. You have to incorporate all the aspects of it so it locks together and creates that pattern or that structure for the samadhi or the realization to occur.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's what I've realized is it's not linear. So with the yamas and the niyamas, that if you're working with those last 3, the dharana, dhyana, and samadhi, even if you haven't achieved the last of the 8 limbs, what's going on, then with the other aspects of the yamas and the niyamas, that they begin to become easier. So it's like this back and forth flow, like you're practicing them all simultaneously.
Right.
And they affect one another back and forth. It's really a beautiful process.
Yeah. It reminds me of, I remember reading Vasista's yoga on the 4 gatekeepers of liberation. And Vasista said, even if you can't practice all of them, if you practice just one, the rest will develop around that.
Yes, I can totally see that.
Well, since we've already discussed how this is nonlinear, we're going to keep this podcast session a little nonlinear, because I want to keep coming back to what we've been talking about, because there's so much there to consider. But before I forget, I want to get 2 other questions out of the way, if that's all right.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So one of the questions I had considered, when looking at the sutras, there is the Ishvara Pranidhana. And so it's often translated, from what I've seen, as like surrender to God. Mm-hmm. But my sense was the idea of Ishvara, while yes, that is could be a term for God, that's not quite exactly clear. It's not like God like we think of it. It's like the Lord of the universe, or the master of this intelligence which is making things happen. So can you tell us a little bit more about that term or that idea within the sutras?
Yes. So let's go to actually Ishvara Pranidhana.
It's the beginning of 2, I think, right?
I think it's 120 something.
By the way, this is great. Like, I was raised Catholic, and I had to go to Sunday school a lot, and I didn't like it. So having the Yoga Sutras in front of me, knowing you're doing it too, I feel like I'm in Sunday school that I actually want to be in.
What's really funny is I used to be a Sunday school teacher. So that's pretty funny.
Well, great. Then we're having a good time.
Miracle. So it's 123. And I have a new version. Let me grab my old version so I'm on the same definition as you. I have like so many of these workbooks. I have my old one here. So even if we look at so here's the thing: if we look at Ishvara Pranidhana in terms of starting with 120. We don't have to chant them or anything, but Shraddha, Virya, Smriti, Samadhi, Pratnya, Purvaka, Itaresham. So in the case of others, Nirodha, which we are all familiar with, I think, is preceded by faith, energy, memory, Samadhi, and primary insight. So this is the beginning of like a movement towards Ishvara Pranidhana, this state of Nirodha that is precipitated by these things, as opposed to a Nirodha where you leave the body, like Prakritilaya Nam, like so. So here, so this is the beginning. So there's Ishvara Pranidhana is an inward movement. And then in the case of those, the next one, Tivra Samveganam Asannaha, in the case of those whose frequency is intense, Nirodha is near. So frequency meaning vibration. We're talking about vibration here. And so,
see what happens there. Like what you just said makes perfect sense. However, and many of the commentaries, and I think that's even what I wrote too. Frequency I was having the idea of frequency of practice, anyway, keep going. This is great.
So no, because they go together. Frequency of practice increases these are the layers.
Yeah. These
are the layers. Frequency of practice increases the frequency of vibration. So they go together, hand in hand. And then the next one, because of let me say, mrudu madhyadima tratvat tatopi visheshaha, because of the degree of mild, moderate, or extreme vibration, frequency, there is a difference in nearness of Nirodha. So Nirodha sets the stage, in a sense, for an understanding of Ishvara. And what's happening here with this vibration, this vibrational frequency, if you think about Viveka Khyati, the continual discernment of the distinction between the seer and what is being seen, the field of consciousness, that's one way to go. And this vibration, this frequency becomes very intense when you're constantly seeing, unobstructedly seeing, without merging or identifying with your field. Or he says, so Ishvara Pranidhanad Va. So Va, or because of Ishvara Pranidhana, the perfect aligning of attention in Ishvara, the ultimate seer. So basically, Ishvara is seen as the inner controller, the ultimate seer, and your true self. So it is at the point where you identify with that greater consciousness, where your individual consciousness merges with Ishvara. And so you, at that point, you can achieve the same frequency simply by Ishvara Pranidhana. And that can be by identifying with an aspect of God, that you feel a devotional. It can be a devotional thing, or it can be through practices, where you just begin to see and see only.
Right. Okay. Yeah. The reason I was curious, that again started so much stuff. The reason I was curious about that was because some people kind of argue that it's an atheistic text, that there's no room for this idea of God or divinity in there. And what I'm hearing you saying is you can use your ideas or concepts as far as you understand it now, or through certain practices which reveal the state, that's also one way to approach this, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I think that, this text perfectly aligns itself with the Bhagavad Gita, mm-hmm. which is a very spiritual text. And so I think it speaks to where each individual actually is.
Right. And those are, from what I was taught from Mr. Davis, who's a student of Yogananda's, that the Yoga Sutras and the Bhagavad Gita were the prime text to study.
Yeah.
And the way I personally saw it was, I considered the Bhagavad Gita as a description of what exactly the spiritual path is going to be like, what you're going to go through, what to expect, what to pay attention to. And then I considered the Yoga Sutras as kind of the manual of how to do it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there's also another text which kind of is overlooked. The Sankhya Karika. Have you heard of that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that is also kind of like a philosophical, esoteric text that underlies, and almost on the other side of the Yoga Sutras. You have the Sankhya Karika, then you have the Yoga Sutras, and then you have the Bhagavad Gita, and they kind of all three work together.
Okay. Well, and is that the text, if I recall correctly, that basically has that beginning that says suffering is inevitable? Is that the right one? Okay. Yeah. So what just came up here was suffering is inevitable, but in the Yoga Sutras, somewhere in there, it says the suffering which has not yet been experienced is to be avoided.
Yes.
So how do you put that together?
Be ended. I always say avoided too, and Vyaas always corrects me.
That is, yes. I don't remember where that is, but I know.
I always, and he would always say ended. That
ties so much together.
In chapter 2. Let me see.
There it is. Is it 2:10?
It might be.
Those subtle are to be ended.
Yes. And the way, and see how he says, so te pratiprasavaheya sukshma. Those, the kleshas, the root causes of pain, are to be ended by inverse propagation. Inverse propagation is exactly what we're doing when we do sanyama.
Right. Okay. All right. Great. So that's a good tie-in. Let's go back now. Let's go back to this work in chapter 3. Okay. So when you are, let's say you're describing this to someone who, they've been practicing meditation, they have their spiritual path, they haven't really dug too deeply into the Yoga Sutras, how would you share or give insights how to begin a practice like that for people?
Sanyama?
Yes.
So probably take a
class on the sutras.
Well, I'm trying to think how I actually teach it is, I start with the first 5 sutras, and just to get a basic understanding of what chitta is, or actually maybe the first 12 sutras. So to get an idea of, so the first 4 give us the overview of what yoga actually is. The idea is that we're going to have an understanding of that, and then an understanding of the vrittis, which would be, and then an understanding of abhyasa and vairagya. So that would be the first 12.
Okay.
And then
well, before you go too far, you said to understand the vrittis, abhyasa, and vairagya, correct?
Right, and chitta, what chitta is.
For those individuals, because a lot of people listen to the podcast which aren't super steeped in Sanskrit, can you tell us a little bit about those 4 things, just to get a general idea, if it's possible?
Okay, yeah, sure. So what are they again? Vrittis?
The vrittis, abhyasa, right? Vairagya.
Yeah, okay. So the vrittis, the chitta is consciousness. Mm-hmm. There's in chapter 13 of the Bhagavad Gita, there's a great description of what the field, chitta is the field of consciousness. And so the field includes everything, your body, your mind, all of the thoughts and experiences that you have, all of that is contained in chitta. Then those thoughts and actions that you take in the world are rooted in vritti. Or so vritti are thoughts or waves. They create waves in the field of consciousness. So, and then basically abhyasa and vairagya. Abhyasa is it translates as practice, but it's a continued effort to stay on a point of focus, whatever that is. So for example, you do your meditation practice every day. That's abhyasa. You do this for a long period of time, which is described in the Yoga Sutras. And vairagya is non-attachment, which goes hand in hand. It's like they're the two wings of yoga. So vairagya is every time you get pulled off that point of focus, you let go of whatever it is that's pulling you off point and come back to point. So you wake up, I'm tired, I don't feel like meditating. So you have to use vairagya to get yourself onto that cushion or onto your mat or whatever your practice is. Right. So that's just a simple description. So abhyasa and vairagya, which are described in Sutra 112, and then it does go on 13, 14, and 15 all describe abhyasa and vairagya. If you want to check it out, if your viewers want to check it out, listeners.
Vyaasa practices vigilance and remaining there.
Yes.
I love that.
Yes. And then it has a firm ground when attended to for a long time without interruption. I think too, and devotion to truth. I feel like that's so important. Right. That often gets overlooked. The devotion to truth part.
Yeah, with the devotion to truth, being a Vedic astrologer, and a lot of people have issues with Saturn. I remember reading The Greatness of Saturn by Robert Svoboda, and there was a story at the end of that. I don't think it was actually in The Greatness of Saturn. It was kind of a secondary story, and it was a discussion on an individual who's getting ready to go through the Siddhi Sati period where Saturn crosses over the moon. And Saturn came and told the person that, and then all the virtues began to leave through his chest, except for the last one to leave was truth. And the man reached up and grabbed truth and said, all the rest of them can go, but you have to stay. Wow. And then once truth stayed, the rest of them said, well, we can't go anywhere without truth. So all the other virtues came back to him. So when I think about the yamas and niyamas again, right. Satya is the one I tend to encourage people, focus on that one and the rest. because if you have devotion to truth, then that creates a current which will keep you engaged in the process, which leads you to more truth. It almost seems like it's a feedback loop of some sort.
That really makes sense. That really makes sense.
Yeah. But why were you focusing on that? I always like to hear when you said, and with devotion to truth, that gets overlooked. What are your insights into that?
It's very basic. Just the idea that doing the practice is enough. Like there has to be more of an emotional connection to what it is, why you're doing it, and the reason that we're doing it is as seekers of truth. So the devotion to truth. Oh,
I see what you're saying. So what you're describing here is, in a sense, you're not doing this for any other reason other than you want to know the truth. That's kind of the point.
Yeah, that's the point. Yeah, that you're not looking for, but it's almost desiring to experience truth directly. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, but it's the same thing that you're talking about, pulling it in to your heart, and then everything else just falls into place.
And vairagya, non-attachment, is the full knowledge of mastery, not clinging to objects already experienced or described by others. What's that? Is that number? That's number 15.
Number 15. Yeah.
So these are wonderful points. And again, what I love about the sutras is when you talked about being nonlinear, we have this description here, but then again, once you get through them all, it's like it all ties together and it all just kind of makes sense.
It kind of
does. Anyway, so we talked about vritti, chitta, abhyasa, vairagya, and those are the four, the four main ideas.
Yeah, and then all of the vrittis are described. So I think one of the most important things to remember, I don't know, I kind of feel like to actually be able to utilize all these, you might need a little bit more guidance than I'm giving, but
well, this is just an introduction, so hopefully
introduction. Okay,
they'll know where to find you.
I feel like the two most important to me, of the vrittis, rather than go through all of them, are direct perception. So we'll say 3, pramana 1-7, which is basically where this practice leads you, is to a direct experience of the truth, of insights, and vikalpa 1-9. I feel is really important. Vikalpa is really imagination, and imagination becomes really key in doing this practice. Like if you're moving into the water element of the body, you're not literally experiencing it. You're using your imagination to get chitta in there, to draw chitta in. Imagination is really important.
Right.
And then the last one is that I feel is super important is smriti, is remembering. If you can remember the experience, you can get back there very quickly. You don't have to go through all the steps that Patanjali lays out necessarily. You can just get there if you can remember.
And that makes sense. If I think about, say, a musician learning a piece of music, once they learn the piece of music, they don't have to go back through every step of learning that piece of music. Once they know it, then it's just there. So if in our practice, we're able to imagine or experience, or if we have an experience of, say, maybe pure consciousness, just by remembering it from the beginning, the next time helps. Is that what you're?
Yeah, exactly. And consequently, you would be able to, at any given point in time, just walk around in that state, because you're able to pull it up at any given moment. If you even remembering to do it, remembering to pull it up,
Right.
So
again, I want to keep on this theme, but one other question that came up. So we're diverging here a little bit. Are you familiar? Or do you have any insights on, when we think about the history of the Yoga Sutras, is this a text that has been commonly practiced, studied, understood, say, in yogic communities over the centuries? Or is this a text that has been around, certainly, but now more recently is becoming more wide known, say in the last, 50, 20 years or so?
Yeah. So my experience, especially studying, having experienced the sutras without Vyaas and then experienced them with Vyaas, is that they are engaged. People tend to engage the sutras. I do believe more recently here in the United States, like in the last 20, 30 years, but it's very intellectual. Even Sanskrit is engaged as an intellectual language, and it's not. It's a spiritual language, so it has to be chanted. It cries out to be chanted, and so the way that the language is taught at university is very intellectual, and so a whole big 3/4 of what the language is about is missed by the scholar. So you really want.
Did you say missed?
Yeah. Completely.
Like Rajas?
Yeah, just completely. Yeah.
Okay. I like that. Go ahead.
Yeah. And you really want to be a practitioner scholar. You don't want to be just a scholar. And it's kind of hard with the sutras or with these yogic texts to be just a practitioner, because there are just not enough teachers, that are teaching at this level that we're talking about, the Vyaas, or even, you or I, where we're taking people deep into the text. I think that, these, especially, like chapter 3, I want to talk about that just for a minute, because it's really the Patanjali, it's like thousands of years, like 2,000 years ago, whatever, codified what the ancient rishis were actually doing, and how, like, so Jyotish, Ayurveda, all of these things, all of these studies and practices were based on an inward movement, on sanyama. Mm-hmm. And the rishis would move inward to discover the truths of the universe. Mm-hmm. And so what Patanjali did was take this practice that all the rishis were doing and codify it with these sutras. Mm-hmm. And then I make up my own little story that, you know, he eventually wrote it down because he noticed there was a decline, right, and that he wanted it to be preserved, and so that we could now rediscover it. And as far as I know, there are not any yoga schools right now that are doing the sanyama practice. Mm-hmm. And so Vyaas really, revivified it. Mm-hmm. The closest is Yoga Nidra. And that is not rooted in sanyama in the same way, because the practice, as Vyaas has kind of pulled it together, is all about awareness and consciousness. So you're moving from the waking state to the deep sleep state, fully awake. Right. You're using the sutras to do that. So it's not Yoga Nidra.
Well, you bring up the idea of Yoga Nidra, and my experience, when I've seen people describe that, they're just doing full body relaxation.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a really watered down, version of what's laid out in the sutras. It is from the sutras, I think.
Yeah. I mean, they talk about it's described in there. And I remember recently reading it again, and I'll have to flip through and find it here. But the description was, what was it? It was, in a way, it seemed to say that when you move towards a state of non-wakefulness, which can be translated, or people think it means going to sleep, like snoring. But when I read it again recently, it seemed like it's avoiding things that lead you to non-wakefulness, as in presence.
Right.
Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
Yeah. And so I'm glad you brought that up, because I've been trying to figure out how, when I see all these things pop up and people are saying, can you teach me Yoga Nidra? And I'm thinking, I know what you want. You want this Shavasana where you're laying down and doing a full body relaxation. But could you describe that practice to someone to get more of what the sutras were indicating? Well, what would you say about that?
Do you mean closer to sanyama?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, you need to sit up.
Right.
Yeah, you need to sit up, and you really, so with the Upanishads, all of these different texts describe this being fully awake in the deep sleep state. And before you can do it awake, walking around or whatever, you really need to be able to do it in this meditative way. Exactly. And sanyama takes you there. And I just can't even, I get chills when I think about it. So that you would be sitting up, and you would go using language, bringing chitta in to the gross, experiencing the water element in the body, then the subtle, which would be like moving into the dream state. And then finally, this is all described in the Sutra 344, Anvaya, which would be the deep sleep state. And this is where all the transformation is taking place, in Anvaya. Mm-hmm. And then finally, for the Bhutajaya, you take a step back and acknowledge that this immersive experience that you've just had in your own being is not who you are. You're the seer. So it's really a mind-blowing practice, and you're awake for the whole thing, so that when you're done, when you finish meditating, you remember. You may not be able to describe the experience, but you remember the experience. Eventually you can describe it, I think.
You described, there aren't enough teachers necessarily who are able to share this, but my question is, even for people who spend time really studying this stuff, this is subtle work. So is there when you're sharing this information, or the practice, or encouraging people to have their own experience, how do you start when you know you're interacting with individuals that the subtle is really way out, getting them to the subtle aspect of things, that's going to take a little while. Mm-hmm. But you know that you can start getting access to it from more gross levels, or just easier to comprehend levels. How do you approach that process to begin guiding people down to those more subtle experiences that can't be talked about or can't be described?
I feel like helping people to vibrate at a different frequency is the first step. So, and rather like just bypassing the mind altogether. And so for me, chanting, like having beginners, and they, it's really can be challenging having them chant an entire chapter, and keep doing that with them every class until they're able to not chant it on their own necessarily, but that they start vibrating in a different frequency. And that really, really helps. So for example, I've been teaching the Sanyama online, and I had advertised it as like, this is what we're going to do. We're going to do Sanyama. And I realized when the people joined the class that they really weren't ready. So I'm like, well, I was planning on doing this anyway. Let's just chant the whole chapter. Mm-hmm. And so by the time we were done chanting chapter 1, they were all exhausted and they were ready to be done.
Right.
And so we kept meeting, and this has really happened by accident. And we kept meeting, and then maybe into the second 6-week series. So we were just once a week for 6 weeks. They were asking, well, what about this meditation that was part of this course? When are we going to try that? And then they were ready. Right. And they were, and so every class still, we chant an entire chapter, and they're vibrating at a different frequency. I'm certainly vibrating at a different frequency.
Right.
And then we do it. And I go through the sutras just baby steps at a time. So 1 through 15, we'll go through those and talk about them. Mm-hmm. And then I go to the Sanyama chapter, so chapter 3, and we just talk about those, dharana, dhyana, and samadhi. The 3 together as one, lead to primary insight, and then right to the Bhutajaya. And then I have a recording, and they practice the Bhutajaya from this recording, which is actually scripted from when Vyaas used to lead us through it. So it's his language, which I kind of like, that, he's still very much a part of this. And, he really has revivified this practice. And, so many yoga practitioners, I'm kind of going off track a little bit, but
hey, that's okay. Remember, we're just keeping it.
That's right. Okay. That's good. Yeah. So many yoga practitioners end up going to Buddhist meditations.
Yes.
Because the real, like the Patanjali meditation just isn't accessible. Mm-hmm. And I think that its time has come. Mm-hmm. I wish Vyaas had taught a little bit longer,
All right. Well, that's why you're here now.
Yeah, I guess that's why I'm here now. I had no choice.
Yeah. And from the Yoga Sutras perspective of, for example, like asana and pranayama and so on, you're talking about chanting, which I've been doing a lot more research into, like the physiological effects of chanting or certain deep breathing exercises, how it affects like the vagus nerve or other aspects of the nervous system. And by doing those sorts of things, you see, just a little background, Mr. Davis, did you ever meet Mr. Roy Davis?
No, I didn't.
Well, he was very, very straightforward, not a lot of excess anything, just right to the point. And I always tried to emulate him because he was my teacher. But I've always been a musician. And so when it came to doing things like chanting or kirtan, I would lead it as he would, like Om Namah Shivaya or Shri Ram Jai Ram, to get the meditation going. But the more I started studying how those kinds of things affect the body, it became clear that by chanting certain things, or even what I love about Vyaas's Yoga Sutras recording, that kind of rhythmic pattern that he says the sutras in, it's almost like that has a particular effect on the body. And pranayama, which is one of the sutras I wanted to ask you about, we might not get to it, but holding the breath a certain way or breathing in a certain pattern breaks the conditioning of the mind in a way so that you catch glimpses of clarity or glimpses of deeper awareness, those sorts of things. So
that makes sense, because when you use pranayama to break what you just described, you're taking it out of the autonomic nervous system and offering it up to the central nervous system with using your mind. So you're really changing everything, the whole dynamic of what it means to breathe and what breathing does. Go ahead. Yeah. I'm sorry. You just got
No. It's fascinating stuff. And even Ramana Maharshi, he would recommend just contemplate, who am I? Or he would say, it's really very simple. All you have to do is be still, which is true. But when people couldn't grasp that, or they couldn't quite just sit there and be still, he would say, mantra, chanting, or certain forms of pranayama help you to access that, to get a sense of it, and until you can move your way into it. So what you're describing in regards to, chanting the whole chapter or chanting aspects of the Yoga Sutras, it makes sense that creates the opening or the field, I guess, not quite the right word, but the space for that subtler aspect of ourselves to come through or be recognized. That's hard to describe.
To connect, and actually to connect with that part of ourselves. Yeah. No, that makes absolute sense.
Yeah. And you mentioned the idea of people going to Buddhist practices. And I was just having a conversation with another Kriya Yoga teacher, and he was saying that a lot of individuals have gone to Buddhist meditation, Buddhist practices, but he was thinking of it from a different angle. He was saying that a lot of yogic practitioners, they have kind of a fantastic idea about what yoga is supposed to do, but Buddhism tends to have a little more of a practical approach of that idea of attachment to life is suffering. So what do you do about it? Whereas a lot of pop culture yoga is more like, you can have the most beautiful, enjoyable, pleasurable life known to man, where the sutras, or I think it's the sutras, the sutras of the Gita, focuses on, endure pleasure and pain while you seek knowledge.
Yeah.
So I find that fascinating.
Yeah, it's really true that and I think it's happening more and more, just that we're talking about this, that people are connecting to the truer underlying philosophy of yoga, and that maybe it's early stages here in this country, especially with the boom, like the so much yoga. I think maybe the early teachers, like when Iyengar came here and all that there was that underlying piece, but it kind of got lost in the boom. And whoever else, Yogananda came here.
Yogananda, Vivekananda, there's a few of them that had that. Came to well, and you also got to think about when they came. I mean, it was the early 1900s, and a brown-skinned person walking around was probably not really well received. So you couldn't just jump right into Samkhya philosophy or the depth of the Yoga Sutras.
Right.
So anyway, well, before we conclude today, we had discussed some things we want to talk about. Did we speak to what you wanted to share, or is there more you would like to talk about this process or the idea of the sutras?
I really wanted to share about Sanyama and the third chapter. And I think the only other thing I would say about it is that not to worry about the siddhis, that the siddhis are merely a sign that you're on the right path. They're not something to be attained.
Right.
So to approach a Sanyama practice with innocence, like a child, and just let it unfold as it's going to unfold, and be enchanted by the experiences you have. And I don't even want to call them powers, by the just by the experiences that you have, but keep moving. You would never stop at that point where The minute you start to try to grasp something, it gets, the subtlety is lost and the beauty is lost. So,
and what you're describing, the sutras go through, it seems to be like this step-by-step procedure of developing more of a sattvic state of awareness. And a lot of people then get to the part where it says, and then you have to let go of sattva too.
Yeah.
So then they would say things to me like, well, why do it in the first place if you have to let go of it? So my thought was, this is the way I tried to describe it. Then I want to hear your perspective on it. I tried to tell them, I said, look, it's like when you've got a child being raised by a family, and that child's being raised and the child loves the parents love the child. So there is attachment there. It's like the attachment to the sattva. But that particular way of raising the child makes it so when the child turns 18 or 19, the child can leave and feel free and say, yes, I love you. We have a good relationship, but I'm not going to be bound to you by any kind of psychological weirdness. I'm going to be able to go off and do my thing. So the way I approached or tried to share this idea of sattva was that developing sattva is like having that healthy relationship, being raised in a healthy relationship where you are strong enough to go out into the world so you can let go of where you came from. So how do people bring that up to you at all? This idea of why do we have to develop it if we're just going to let go of it?
You know what? This is so funny because I have a story, but it didn't come up for the same reason. I just told it on last night, last night. The story of Ramakrishna, and it actually goes perfectly with the way that you describe it, where he was a great devotee of the goddess Kali in her mother form. And he would experience her as this amazing light. And, he was definitely an enlightened being. But he did not want to go beyond this experience of Kali, of his mother, of this mother goddess. And so he resisted it until finally a sadhu came wandering through and said, you really need to move beyond this. You're supposed to. It's part of your dharma. And he refused. He didn't refuse. He's just like, no, I'm really content where I am. And so the sadhu put a sharp rock into his third eye, just like kind of poked him in the third eye and made him move beyond, even though it was kind of like John the Baptist and Jesus or something,
right.
Like he just came and pushed him to that next level. But he was very attached, even in his, and so it was the child being attached to the mother in that case. But,
so even in that profoundness, that was something that needed to be moved on from.
Yeah. And to be honest with you, it's not something that I think about a lot, but now you have me really thinking about it. It's like, I think about it in the context of my meditation, not getting stuck on the subtle, because there's always something more subtle to go to. So why, but as far as like in life, even talking to my students about it in that way, I think I might contemplate doing that more, because that's very true.
Yeah,
it's very true. And they should be prepared for that.
Right. Excellent. Well, it was so wonderful to have you on the podcast today. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And you are the director of the American Sanskrit Institute, and the website for people to learn more about this is www.americansanskrit.com. And then you also have a website, sanskritshalla.org. So sanskritshalla.org. Yeah. So I'd like to encourage people to go to that. And I will put it in the notes of the podcast so people can find it and click on it.
Thank you.
So thank you so much for being here. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you.
This episode of the Kriya Yoga Podcast was made possible by donations from Kriya Yoga apprenticeship students and supporters of our Patreon community at www.patreon.com/Kriya Yoga.